Hey everyone, this is James from TDB bringing you another Inbetweenisode. Today I am going to be talking about one concept as well as drinking a tea. I'm going to be talking about mismatched tea, what exactly does that mean, and then I'm going to be drinking a tea that Denny and I brought on to an episode in December. It's a ripe pour. We're going to be drinking that in the big blue pot that I'm sure a lot of regular followers are used to. So what is mismatched tea? What do I mean by that exactly? And really what I mean is a combination of usually two different things, both of which might be common on their own, but are usually not paired together. One example that comes to mind, for instance, is a high roasted tea. Not uncommon, easy to find high roasted tea, but make it a high mountain oolong. Again, high mountain oolong, not hard to find, but pretty difficult to find roasted high mountain Taiwanese oolong, just because there's not a lot of that. Now, so there's a couple reasons why this might be uncommon. One of the reasons is maybe it's a bad combination. Maybe it just doesn't make sense as far as the tea goes, and there's a reason why people are not interested in that. The other reason could be just like market forces, and even though the tea could be interesting and good in a lot of people's eyes, maybe there's just more of a market for very much like the verdant green high mountain oolong. I would certainly make the case when it comes to Taiwanese tea that it's probably more of the latter. I would certainly be interested in a roasted high mountain oolong. And so, I mean, I will buy as roasty as I can find, but even then, it's not necessarily up to what I want. So usually what I would want is something a little more oxidized. So anyways, we're not going to be talking completely about that. We're going to be talking instead about another mismatched combination, and that is a combination of the Yibang ripe. So why is this mismatched? It's a Yunnan tea, Pu'erh tea, and it's ripe, so that would seemingly be very, very common. So there's two reasons I can think of. First of which, Yibang, the location, is central to why this is mismatched. It is one of the 6 famous tea mountains. It's part of what I like to call the greater Yiwu area of Mengla County. So a bunch of different mountains over there, Mengzhi, Yola, a bunch of them. And anyways, that area of growing is really most associated with raw pu'erh, specifically with boutique raw pu'erh. In fact, you could even make the case that something like a big factory Yiwu tea would be a little bit of a mismatch. Not quite as mismatched as a ripe per se, but like if you had a Menghai Tea Factory Yiwu, that would catch your eye as being just a little unusual because Menghai Tea Factory is mostly known for producing raw pu'erh that is not named to be Yiwu and usually from Menglan County and kind of other areas blended together. So that would make this tea unusual because it is kind of from that eastern Xishuangbanna area and it has been made into ripe tea. The other reason is it's Yibang. Now, Yibang is unusual even amongst the 6 famous tea mountains because it is also small leaf, unlike almost all of the rest of Yunnan. There's a couple places in Yunnan, Jingmai is another one, where you are going to have that small leaf varietal too. But Yibang is going to stand out as being one of like the most famous of those places too. So in drinking this tea, we are drinking something that is definitely, well, there's plenty of Yibang tea and plenty of ripe tea. It's pretty rare to find this combination of them. And so trying to figure out if this is a combination that makes sense or less so. One of the reasons why this probably doesn't make sense in terms of a market sensibility way is just because ripe tea tends to be more, more daily drinker, a little cheaper. I think if you calculated the average ripe tea that people are pressing versus the average raw tea, I think the raw tea is going to be considerably more expensive. And the tea in kind of the greater Yiwu, 6 famous tea mountains, is not cheap. In fact, it's definitely well above average as far as what you would expect even for raw tea. So it's like if someone is shopping for kind of like their regular ripe tea, and they're like, okay, I'm used to shopping for stuff that's like $30 to $50. An Yibang tea is never going to be that cheap, really. So you're going to have to pay a little bit more for that. And so as a result, this tea, of course, is something like 30 cents a gram. By no means an unreasonable price, certainly not for Yibang tea, but for a ripe, that's certainly above average. So it also encourages you to sort of think about your different baselines as far as price is concerned. Okay, so that is a lot of chit chat. I've been drinking this tea just like I do all my other ripes. Have about 10.4 grams here. Have been drinking it throughout the morning. It's still the morning here. Cheers. So this is interesting. It has a very, so it's definitely ripe. It doesn't taste like something totally unusual or anything like that. There's maybe a hint more of brightness, but it's still kind of that very baseline woodiness. The tea is definitely not immediately sweet or anything like that, but actually does kind of have this nice lingeringness to it. In fact, if you're describing sort of like Iwu area teas too, those teas tend to be a little more, some people will describe it as subtle. The strength is often a little bit more hidden beneath the surface compared to other more brash Pu'erh teas. That's true for Iwu raws. I think that's also probably true for this tea. I think the what makes it interesting and unique is something you have to pay a little more attention to. It's not going to bash you over the head. So, for instance, like one other tea that Scott has made that really stands out are the ripes that become bitter. The Yibang that Denny and I drank recently, maybe a couple months ago. That one stood out because it really hits hard in terms of bitterness and things. That one's unsubtlety in terms of what it's bringing to the table. I think the Yibang, I think this tea is definitely pretty interesting, but I don't think that interesting presents itself in quite the same way as those. And in fact, it's kind of exactly what you would expect from a ripe tea pressed from kind of the material that is a little more mellow. So yeah, let's dig in. Let's take a good smell of this now that we have some hot water hitting the leaf. Pretty typical ripe smells. I can't say that it smells really unusual. Again, we are fairly deep into the session too, 5 or 6 steeps in already, so that could be perhaps one of it too. I am noticing that the aftertaste is lingering. It has this nice mouth-wateringness. Aftertaste is not often something I pay attention to. Ripe to me is like a daily grinder, very easy to drink, but not something I need to pay a lot of attention to. For me, at least, this tea, I do need to pay attention to it a bit more in order to get kind of the charms and things like that about it. Another thing that crosses my mind specifically about this tea too, and perhaps related to the subtleness of it, is that if one person is a regular ripe drinker, I think the things that set this tea apart are going to be more obvious than someone that doesn't drink ripe very often and then comes to this. It's just, it's not different in a super obvious way, like something like the Yibang is. This one is definitely like a pay attention and notice kind of aftertaste and stuff. So things that might be associated with appreciating raw pu'erh, but I can definitely tell that the material is definitely a bit different here. The leaves are pretty dark, so I don't think, this one probably had a medium to low fermentation. It's definitely not heavy fermented, but it's not super light either. Nice texture to it too, and the body is reasonably thick. I'm trying to think and remember kind of ebang ripes. It's been a while since I had like specifically an ebang ripe or ebang raw rather, and if I recall, they actually tend to be a little more kind of flavor forward in terms of fruit and things like that with them. They do have a lot of kind of those greater Iwu characteristics as well, certainly more mellow. You're not going to mistake those teas very easily with a oolong tea, but they do have, there's a reason why it is one of the more reasonably sought after regions too. The other thing that crossed my mind too is, sometimes the mismatch works pretty well in terms of this. I think in this case it does work pretty well. A lot of it is still about the execution of this. If you just over-ripen these leaves and like blended it with material that wouldn't kind of showcase it, like I do think this tea kind of needs to be on its own or blended with somewhat like-minded material for it to work. If you were to blend this with stronger like Munghai County material, I don't know if it presents and works in quite the same way. You do kind of need this to just sort of stand on its own in order to pick up on the charms to it. And the other thing too is like it's interesting to see that these teas have become more and more sort of a regular pressing for people. If you look at white tea, you look at Yunnan sourcing, you'll see that they are pressing a good number of fairly higher end ripes. I would count this tea amongst them. 30 cents a gram is, a decent price to pay relative to kind of the lower average baseline price for ripe tea. And I'm happy to see it because I think still a huge amount of these materials is going into raw, and I'm glad to see people must be buying these teas for them to be pressing it year after year. At this point, you have really, really high-end ripes like the white tea one we brought on the other day, forgetting the name exactly. You have slightly less higher-end ones, such as this. So I'm happy to see people are buying them, and I'm personally happy to see that they're being created just because it creates a little more variety in a tea category that is pretty monotonous overall. I also think these are pretty well executed as well. I think if you just you had someone just randomly ripen some leaves and put them together, it's not going to come together like this too. So I think it's probably the right choice in terms of this. I'm usually a fan of blends, but I think in this case it makes a lot of sense to have this material sort of stand alone. And there's just a very subtle sweetness that's a little different to this too. Very interesting. Yeah, it's almost like taste-wise, it's a little on the bland end, as you might expect. Aroma-wise, it's a little richer, and then the texture and aftertaste, I think, are really where it shines. The texture and kind of like that second wave of flavor is really where it hits you. And then the way it lingers in the mouth and has like sweetness and things like that, the huigan, I think those are quite nice as well. And just kind of leaves me with my mouth salivating a little bit in a very pleasant way. Okay, so thank you all for tuning in. Let me know how you like this episode. Hit the subscribe button, hit the thumbs up button if you'd like to see more. Shout out to Scott for making this tea. Thank you all for tuning in again, and I'll see you all next time. Cheers.